Chapter 3. The Slaughterers. As Twig continued to rise up through the cold, dark air, the rope dug painfully into the bottom of his ribs. He gasped for breath, and as he did so, a curious whiff of acrid smoke filled his head. It was a mixture of wood, smoke, leather, and a pungent smell that Twig couldn't identify. Above him, Gristle grunted urgently. "Are we near your village?" Twig asked. Gristle grunted again, more instantly this time. Suddenly, between the leaves, Twig caught sight of flickering flames and blood-red smoke. There was a fire not 20 paces away. "Help!" Twig bellowed. "Help us!" Almost at once, the ground below him was swarming with blood-red slaughterers, each carrying a flaming torch. "Up here!" Twig shrieked. The slaughterers raised their heads. One of them pointed. Then, without a word being spoken, they slipped into action. Calm and methodical, they removed ropes which had been hanging round their shoulders and made slip knots at one end. Then, with the same unhurried sense of purpose, they began tossing the makeshift lassos up into the air. Twig moaned as the ropes tumbled back through the air beneath him. He spread his legs wide and held his feet out, hooked and rigid. The slaughterers tried again, but with Gristle pulling him still higher, their task was getting more difficult by the second. "Come on," Twig muttered impatiently, as the slaughterers tried again and again to lasso of his feet. Above him, he heard muffled cries as Gristle's inflated body crashed through the uppermost branches. The next instant, Twig's own head plunged into the dense green canopy. The bruised leaves gave off a lush, earthy smell. What will it look like? Twig found himself wondering. Above the Deepwoods, in the realm of the sky pirates. Before he had a chance to find out, he felt something land on his hooked foot and tightened around his ankle. One of the slaughterer's ropes had found its target at last. There was a strong tug on his leg. Then another, and another. The leaves slapped back into his face, and the earthy smell grew stronger. All at once, he saw the ground way down below him, and his foot with the loop of rope around his ankle. 20 or so of the slaughterers had a hold of their other end. Slowly, jerkily, they were pulling the rope in. When Twig's feet finally touched the ground, the slaughterers immediately turned their attention to Gristle. Working in utter silence, they slipped their ropes around his arms and legs and took the strain. Then, one of them pulled out his knife and sliced through the rope, which was still tied around Twig's chest. And Twig was free. He bent double and breathed in deeply gratefully. "Thank you," he wheezed. "I don't think I could have lasted much longer. He looked up. With the immense bulk of Gristle tethered above them, the whole group of slaughterers was trotting back to the village. Twig had been left on his own. What was more, it was beginning to snow. "Thanks a lot," he snorted. "They're worried is all," came a voice from behind him. Twig looked around. A slaughterer girl was standing there, her face lit up by the flickering light of her flaming torch. She touched her forehead and smiled. Twig smiled back. "I'm Sinew," she said. "Gristle's my brother. He's been missing for 3 nights. "Do you think he'll be all right?" asked Twig. "As long as they get an antidote inside him before he explodes," she said. "Explodes?" cried Twig, trying not to imagine what would have happened if they had soared up into the sky. Sinew nodded. "The venom turns to hot air, and there's only so much hot air a person can take," she added grimly. Behind her came the sound of a gong being banged. "Come," she said. "You look hungry. Lunch is about to be served." "Lunch?" said Twig. "But it's the middle of the night." "Of course," said Sinew, puzzled. "I suppose you eat lunch in the middle of the day," she said, and laughed. "Well, yes," said Twig. "Actually, we do." Sinew shook her head. "You're strange," she said. "No," Twig chuckled as he followed her through the trees. "I'm Twig." As the village opened up in front of him, Twig stopped and stared. It was all so very different from his own village. The Slaughters lived in squat huts, rather than tree cabins. And whereas the wood troll cabins were all tiled with luffwood for buoyancy, the Slaughterers had constructed their huts with dense leadwood which anchored them firmly to the ground. There were no doors to their dwellings, only thick hamelhorn skin curtains designed to keep out draughts, not neighbors. Sinew led Twig towards the fire he had first glimpsed through the overhead branches. It was huge and hot, burning on a raised circular stone platform in the very center of the village. Twig looked behind him in amazement. Although beyond the village the snow was falling thicker than ever before, none fell inside. The dome of warmth from the blazing fire was so intense that it melted the snow away to nothing before it could ever land. 4 long trestle tables set for lunch formed a square around the fire. "Sit anywhere," said Sinew, as she plonked herself down. Twig sat beside her and stared ahead at the roaring flames. Although the fire was burning fiercely, each and every log remained on the ground. "What are you thinking?" he heard Sinew say. Twig sighed. "Where I come from," he said, "we burn buoyant wood. Luffwood. Lullaby, you know? It's all right, but you have to use a stove. I've never seen a fire outside like this." Sinew looked concerned. "Would you rather go in?" "No," said Twig. "That's not what I meant. This is nice. At home, well, where I was brought up, everyone disappears inside their cabins when it's cold. It can be very lonely when the weather's bad." Twig didn't add that it was pretty lonely for him the rest of the time, too. By now all the branches were full, and at their far end the first course was already being served. As a delicious fragrance wafted across, Twig realized just how hungry he was. "I recognize that smell," he said. "What is it?" "Tilder's sausage soup, I think," said Sinew. Twig smiled to himself. "Of course! The soup was a delicacy the grown-up wood trolls got to eat on Woodgus night. Every year he wondered what it tasted like. Now he was about to find out. "Move your elbow, love," came a voice from behind him. Twig looked around. An old woman was standing there with a ladle in her right hand and a round pot in her left. When she saw Twig, she drew back sharply. Her smile disappeared, and she gave a little shriek. "A ghost!" she gasped. "It's all right, Grand Tatum," said Sinew, leaning over. "This is Twig. He's from outside. It's him we have to thank for saving Gristle's life." The old woman stared at Twig. "It was you who brought Gristle back to us?" she said. Twig nodded. The old woman touched her forehead and bowed. "Welcome," she said. Then she lifted both her arms high in the air and beat the soup pot loudly with the ladle. "Hush up!" she cried. She climbed onto the bench and looked at the square, expectant faces. "We have in our midst a brave young man by the name of Twig. He rescued our Gristle and brought him back to us. I want you all to raise your glasses and bid him welcome." All around the table the Slaughterers, young and old, stood up, touched their foreheads, raised their glasses, and cried out, "Welcome, Twig!" Twig looked down shyly. "It was nothing," he mumbled. "And now," said Graham Tatum, climbing down, "I dare say you're feeling hungry. Tuck in, love," she said, as she ladled the soup into his bowl. "And let's see if we can't get some color into those cheeks of yours," she added. The Tilder sausage soup tasted delicious, as if it had smelled. Simmered until the sausages were soft, in stock seasoned with nibblelick and orange grass. The soup was rich and spicy. It was also just the start. Juicy hamelhorn steaks, rolled in seasoned knot-root flour, and deep-fried in Tilder oil came next, accompanied by earth apples and tangy blue salad. And this was followed by honey trifle and delberry blandsmage with small wafer biscuits drenched in treacle. Twig had never eaten so well, nor drunk so much. A large jug full of wood apple cider stood in the center of each of the 4 tables, and Twig's mug was never allowed to empty.